Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories in film, media, entertainment, and give you my thoughts. If you're joining us live, super happy to have you. If at any point during the show you have any questions or comments about any of the topics I'm going to be covering, feel free to drop them in the live chat. I have it pulled up here. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on it best I can. Hopefully we can kind of get a conversation going, you know. I always say that every week, but everyone's too shy to say anything unless there's just nobody here. So if you have any of those comments, feel free to drop them in the live chat. And if you haven't already, please like this live stream. It really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding this channel. And if you happen to have found this channel, you've stumbled upon it, why not subscribe? Because it's, you know, trying to grow this community. We'd love to have you be part of it. If you're watching this after the fact, still super happy to have you. If at any point, you know, you want to be jumping around to the different stories, by the time you're watching this, there should be time codes in the description. So, you know, you could jump around at your leisure. We stream this show every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And same deal as before. If you haven't already, please like this video and do not forget to subscribe. Okay, let's take a look at the box office from this past week. Total domestic box office was a little over $238 million, which was a slight drop from the week prior. Which again makes sense because it's following two, you know, fairly big holiday weeks. The Christmas week more so, but New Year's is definitely a period of increased, you know, movie going, I guess, if you will. You know, perhaps not certain kinds of adults if you're a little bit hungover from you know, the party the night before, but most people have that day off, that New Year's Day. And interestingly, there weren't really any major new films opening. At least nothing that made it into the top 10. And if you look here, the top 10 is almost exactly where it was last week, save for a couple, which I'll talk about. But still at number one, we have Mufasa the Lion King, bringing in $55 million. So this is really interesting. What's interesting is the way this movie has been holding out. Only had a 29% drop, so basically matched the entire week's drop. But if you look at that domestic multiple, this has been a surprising moderate success. Again, it only opened around 35 million, and so far it's made, you know, over 168 million. So it's really had a strong life, you know, following that initial opening. And lucky for Mufasa, the Circle of Life has not come for it yet. It is still very much making its way through American moviegoers. And it's now I would deem a profitable movie, right? So worldwide it's brought in $476 million off of a $200 million budget. So it has more than doubled its budget, which again is a big surprise because it's been getting mediocre reviews. You know, I've talked about this. I saw it. I thought it was fine, but better than it had been made out to seem. It had been made out to seem like this soulless, lifeless corporate husk. And it is that to a degree, but not to the degree that it had been portrayed, right? And what's interesting is how it is outperforming Sonic 3, right? So that's also still at number 2. Brought in a little, it wasn't that much below, but still below, around 51 million. And it's interesting because, you know, it was at 60. It opened at 60, and then, like everything, because that and Mufasa opened the same day. It was like right before Christmas. The Christmas week, everything got a huge bump, and it's been kind of slowly trickling down. So, you know, it's you know, in its third week now. I guess you would call it third frame, the third weekend. In its third weekend box or week gross is not that far off from the opening. And in Mufasa's case, it's actually more than where it opened. So, you know, again, that Christmas boost really does help. And I'd be interested to learn more about how the Christmas box office season has been in decades past. All I know from purely anecdotal observation that what really made this, like that last week before Christmas, a huge box office player was the return of Star Wars, right? With Episode 7, The Force Awakens. That being not only a well-performing movie, but one of the best-performing movies of all time. And I feel like ever since people have been chasing that high, And I don't know if we'll ever get that again, but this Sonic 3 is another example of that. And while it's beating Mufasa domestically, it is far trailing behind worldwide, which again is really interesting because ostensibly Sonic 3 is, Sonic is a Japanese franchise, right? At its core, I mean, that's where it comes from. My guess is, and I talked about this before, my guess is that, while the franchise Sonic is Japanese and therefore more international, right? Like Sega was really popular in the 90s in Europe more so than the United States. But here, I think what's going on is that the Sonic movies are very, very American in terms of their sensibility, their comedy, and things like that don't always translate. Sensibilities and comedy and humor don't always translate super well. Whereas something like Mufasa obviously is very much still an American film and, has humor in it. It is a lot more classical in its narrative. It's like very cookie cutter, maybe is the wrong word, but it's, it's like a story, an epic story of survival and family and all this stuff. And then it's also a visual spectacle, right? So that might be explaining why Mufasa is doing so much better internationally than Sonic 3. Though Sonic 3 does have a better percent return, right? Because it was maybe 60% the cost. So and that's always the name of the game is not just how much money you bring in, but based off of the dollar for dollar return. Interestingly, here we have Moana 2 jumping a spot, or 2 spots actually, jumping from 5th to 3rd. Now in its sixth week, bringing just a little under 30 million, only a 17% drop. So this kind of outperformed the week. And this has also been holding really well. Something that's not true. I was anticipating it just by the strength of the Moana brand, but again, kind of like Mufasa, it's just been getting very mediocre, whatever reviews. But this is on track to, I think this might. I've been going back and forth. I feel like every week I say something different. I go back and forth, say it's either it's gonna make $1 billion or it's not gonna make $1 billion. I'm not sure where we're gonna fall here, right? Because let's see, last weekend it was around 883, and now it's at 960. It could, by that logic, it could very well cross $1 billion in the next week or two, which would be a huge success for Disney. And of course, like I always say, it will teach Disney the lesson of, we gotta stop making all these weird new movies. We just have to make sequels and spin-offs of stuff. But the percent return has also been pretty good. Cheaper than, it was cheaper to make them something like Mufasa. And Moana 2's biggest rival, I would say, and perhaps this is maybe, you hate to see two beautiful women pitted against each other, right? But its main box office rival, I feel like, has been Wicked. Both female-centric musicals, obviously very different in terms of target demographic, and obviously one's animated, one's live action. One's much more complex and one's more simple, but the fact that they both open around the same time, and they've basically been kind of like right there. In this case, I think this is like one of the first weeks. I could be wrong, but there's a movie in between them. Whereas I feel like for most weeks since they both came out, they've been touching. It's either been one over the other, right? And Wicked had kind of retaken its place ahead of Moana 2, but it looks like it's starting to lose a little bit of steam here, right? So Wicked is actually dropped a spot, because Moana jumped 2 spots. That means 2 things had to drop down. So Wicked, in its 7th week, though, right? So this is still very, very strong performance here for Wicked, but it dropped from 4th to 5th, only bringing in about 26 million. Underperformed the week in terms of a 35% drop. But again, look at the domestic multiple, right? So this has had very strong staying power, as I knew it would. That the film, which is weird, and we're going to talk about it in other parts of the show, but Wicked seems to have lost some awards momentum. which is really interesting. I would have thought this was a shoo-in, but at least financially, it's still bringing in the bacon, right? And it has made more domestically than Wicked. Than Moana 2. But again, kind of like with Mufasa and Sonic, when you look at the worldwide numbers, it's flipped. Whereas Wicked is only around 680-ish, 681 million worldwide. Still very much a profitable movie, but not as profitable because it was basically made for around the same amount as Moana 2, but it has only made maybe 2/3 of what Moana 2 has made. Also still in the top 5, again, like I mentioned, something else had to drop in order for Moana 2 to ascend. We have Nosferatu dropping from 3rd to 4th place now in its second week. Made about 28 million for the weekend. Underperformed the week slightly, but it's been holding decently, right? So, and actually more than decently. Like, this is actually done fairly well. It's made almost $70 million domestically, $100 million worldwide. So, this is now, I would say, in the profitable zone. It is more, just barely, by, about a couple $100,000, but it has, doubled that budget amount. This is a movie, I've been so busy with traveling and then trying to catch up on work. This is one of several movies that I was planning on going to see over the past week or so that I had to cancel. But I've heard really, really great things. I love Robert Eggers' work, so I'm hoping I can get to see it before it's out of theaters. Looking at some other stuff here in the top 10 of note, right? So I guess, because again, basically this is exactly the same as it was last week. Of note here, Gladiator 2. Also, it opened the same week as Wicked. Still in the top 10. Dropped from 7th to 8th place, though. Brought in a little under 6 million. But, it's been holding, right? And that's the weird thing about this, is that it's been holding fairly well, considering it opened around 55 million, and it's brought in about 169 million domestically. Worldwide, it's also done fairly well, around 450 million. But again, the caveat is that it was a very expensive movie. Probably for all the cast and crew salaries. So while it's made back the budget, it hasn't doubled the budget. So it's still kind of in this weird gray zone, right? Another thing of note here is that Baby Girl, Gladiator 2 dropped a spot to make room for Baby Girl. So Baby Girl actually jumped a little bit. Made a little under 9 million from 8th to 7th place. Now in its third week, though, because I think this opened Christmas Day, it was actually a 21% jump in terms of the money that it brought in. But, it's still in the red. But again, a movie like this is not, a huge money-making enterprise, to be sure. I forget who's distributing Baby Girl. I want to say A24, but I could be wrong. Yes, A24, exactly. So, yeah, so it's your mileage is going to vary, right? So it's made about 16 million worldwide, but it costs like 20 million to make. So, it's still a crapshoot on these kinds of movies. It's been a little bit of a meme, this movie, which is good for a small indie movie. But I'm not sure how much more steam it has unless it gets some kind of miraculous Oscar nom for maybe Best Actress for Nicole Kidman or something, and then it gets like a little bit of an awards bump. But it's looking, again, it's kind of a boring box office week. A complete unknown, obviously still here. Small movies like Homestead and The Fire Inside. It's again, January is kind of a no man's land in the yearly box office season. It's really just the place for the big heavy hitters from November, December to make some more cash. Rarely do we have big movies being released here. Because I think everyone is tired and has spent all their money. They don't want to go see new shit. So you really won't see anything super, super interesting opening until February, March, but really into April and May and so on. Not to say there's not going to be some indie movies that don't open up that are going to be really good. But just in terms of big things that are going to be like in the top 10 that we're going to be talking about, it's right now it's kind of a weird limbo state. And looking ahead to this upcoming weekend, we have Den of Thieves 2, Pantera. This is a sequel to a movie I know literally nothing about. Just from like the posters, it looks some weird, like Oh, I guess it's a heist film. I was completely wrong. You never judge a book by its cover. I was gonna say it had something to do with, like the constant glorifying of like the intelligence community we have in the United States. But it looks like it's more of like a heist thing. But I literally had never heard of this until, obviously doing this research for the show. It's projected to make around, 12 to 19 million. I'm going to put a target around 15. Again, the biggest things opening in this period are going to be these really smaller, these much smaller, I should say, enterprises. And then also we have Better Man, the Robbie Williams biopic, where Robbie Williams is a monkey. They do like motion capture. This is directed by the Greatest Showman director. This has already actually come out, but it's now going to be going wide. So most likely it'll end up in the top 10. This wide release, it's projected to open around 4 to 9 million. I'm going to put a target around 7. I've actually heard that it's much better than it seems. And I'm a huge musical fan, and this kind of seems like it's not quite a biopic. It's almost like a musical biopic, kind of like the Elton John one from a couple years back. So, and just the conceit of doing it where he's a monkey for some reason, that just seems really interesting and different. So, I'm definitely gonna try to see this once it goes wide and it's playing in a little bit more theaters. But again, notably, this is a wide release, and we're talking single digits here. Okay, before we're going on, just want to give a quick plug. I have another YouTube channel called Peter Squared, where I cover topics related to film and media entertainment in a more structured video essay format. The video I have up there right now is called A Closer Look at Frozen, where, you guessed it, I take a closer look at the Disney film Frozen, taking a look at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between, using these cartoon versions of like the young and old version of myself. It's a lot of fun. I'd really appreciate if you could go check it out and let me know why you disagree with everything I said. You can find that in the link down in the description below. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Nothing better than having a nice cup of water and going after it. Okay, let's talk about story number 1. So the 2025 Golden Globes aired this past Sunday. Admittedly, I did not watch it. I was busy. And I kind of had zero interest because the Golden Globes have kind of become a snooze fest. And I was just like, I have so much other shit going on. I'm not going to watch it. Which is perhaps unfortunate, because from what I was reading about it, actually seems like it was a kind of interesting evening. So it was hosted by comedian Nikki Glaser. Of course, it was broadcast on CBS. I believe it's the second year that it's been on CBS. From what it seems, she had a lot more time to prepare than last year's disastrous host, Joe Coy, who didn't have a lot of, prep time. He was hired very late, so was doing these awful jokes and started like blaming the writers on air about how bad the jokes were. Which is just really distasteful in my opinion. We all know why this is bad. You don't need to like call them out on the air in the moment, right? And I don't really know much about Nikki Glaser. I guess she's kind of known best for her dark and often like offensive brand of humor. There was a great Hollywood Reporter article that should be, if you're watching this as like a separate video, you should be able to find the description of my sources. And there's a great Hollywood Reporter article that kind of compiled all of her best her jokes. And I've selected a couple here just to give you a sense of her kind of brand of humor. So one of the things she said on Sunday for the broadcast was, quote, "Wicked, queer, night bitch. These are not just words Ben Affleck yells after he orgasms. These are some of the incredible movies nominated tonight," end quote, which is really funny. Of course, awards hosts like these, will kind of do some, not crowd work where it's improvised, but crowd work like talk about, oh, look, there's this celebrity, and then insert joke about them here, right? But she did one for Zendaya, saying, quote, "Challengers, girl, oh my god, that was so good. That movie was more sexually charged than Diddy's credit card. I know I'm upset too. The after party isn't going to be as good this year, but we have to move on. A Stanley Tucci freak off just doesn't have the same ring to it. No baby oil this year, just lots of olive oil," end quote. A little much, Nikki Glaser, I don't know if we need to be punching down and making fun of, a super predator. Not because we don't want to make fun of him, but rather like making light of the situation. But that kind of gives you a sense of her brand of comedy, right? And, you know, she really came to prominence through, like, comedy roasts, right? I think the big one was Netflix's... Was it on Netflix? The roast of Tom Brady. But, you know, she made clear that she wasn't there to roast people, saying, quote, "I'm not here to roast you tonight. How could I? You're all so powerful. You could really do anything, except tell the country who to vote for. It's okay. You'll do it next time." End quote. So, very, you know, sardonic, you know, take it or leave it kind of humor. Certainly some people's cup of tea, definitely not other people's cup of tea, right? And notably, she's the first woman to host the ceremony solo, right? Notably, I think for years, Tina Fey and Amy Poehler did like a co-host situation, which was pretty well liked, and it was not just one year, but multiple years in a row. And, you know, she even addressed it again in a joke during the broadcast, saying, quote, "A room full of producers in the Beverly Hilton, and this time I have all my clothes on," end quote. So, you know, it's definitely, again, like I said, a certain brand of humor. And the viewership seems to be in line where it was last year about. So the initial figures I read were about 10.1 million, which would be an increase from 2024. But literally like maybe 30 minutes before going live tonight, I was seeing articles that the updated figures were actually less than 2024's, but not by much. It was a single digit percent. But in any case, you know, we're still in the same ballpark, which is good because 2024 itself was a 50% increase from the NBC's broadcast of the show back in 2023. So it's, you know, at the very least, it has either gained a little bit of viewership or lost just a little bit, but it's still kind of in the same place where it was, but definitely way less than where it was maybe 10 years ago, right? So let's talk about the major winners. Not because we really care about who won the Golden Globes, but what does it say about award season and the Oscar race, right? So these aren't all the awards, but these are most of them. These are like the ones that I care about. And notably, maybe I should have said this at the top, I'm only looking at the film stuff here. Because I just don't watch enough TV to be able to talk about any of the people confidently. Whereas with this, I have some familiarity with, I've seen some of these movies or I've heard people talk about these movies and these performances. So, of course, the Golden Globes has a weird thing where they basically break it up into two different groups. You have dramas and then musical or comedy. That's like one category. And it's always funny because certain things end up in a category that really shouldn't. So, like, usually it's things that aren't really a comedy end up in the musical or comedy category. It's not that it's like Schindler's List level of dramatic, but just like not quite a comedy either, right? So let's go through the major awards. So, Best Drama went to The Brutalist, which is a 3.5 hour historical film about a Jewish architect who, after World War II, comes to America and becomes this really boring guy. I've heard it's incredible. I'm just trying to figure out when to go see it, because it's like 3.5 hours long, and I don't know if I want to go do that after work when I have to get up the next day for work. So I need to still find it. But anyway, so that's one Best Drama. Best Musical or Comedy, Amelia Perez. So this is the Netflix musical, which is based off of an like an opera or operetta about let me pull up Wikipedia. Let me pull up Amelia Perez for you. And let me just read you the little like description of what the plot's about. So the film is about a Mexican cartel leader who enlists a lawyer, played by Zoe Saldana, to help her disappear and achieve her dream of transitioning into a woman. It's very strange premise, not because transness is strange, but just like a very convoluted storyline, and has not been getting very good reviews. Like, if you think you've gone Letterboxd, it has like a 2.9 out of 5. And I remember a lot of people were surprised, myself included, when Amelia Perez had the most nominations this year for the Golden Globes. And spoiler alert, it also had the most wins, again, including the top award for its category. For Best Actor in Drama, we had Adrian Brody for The Brutalist. For Musical or Comedy, we had Sebastian Stan as in A Different Man, which is another indie film that I won't belabor too much. Best Actress for Drama went to Fernanda Torres for I think it's a Portuguese film, or I think it's Brazilian, perhaps. I'm Still Here, which, again, just like an indie domestic drama kind of film. So it's interesting that it ended up in the Golden Globes, because the Golden Globes always feel a lot more like pop, almost like it's like bigger movies. It is a Portuguese. Well, no, not Portuguese. The language is Portuguese. Yeah, it's Brazil. It's from Brazil. It's a political biographical drama based on Marcelo Ruben Paiva's 2015 memoir of the same name. And it's about a mother and activist coping with the forced disappearance of her husband. So, like, by like the military dictatorship, right? So it's interesting that she was able to get that win. And then Best Actress for Musical or Comedy, Demi Moore from The Substance. The Substance being kind of a Lynchian body horror Cronenberg-esque story about the pressures we put on women in the entertainment industry. And she had a pretty good speech that I listened to a little bit of, feeling like she was not worthy of an award like this. She'd been told that she was more of like a popcorn actress, so this was really validating for her, especially as like a not a 23-year-old woman. Like she is middle-aged, right? Then a couple of awards: Best Supporting Actor Kieran Culkin for A Real Pain, Best Supporting Actress Zoe Saldana, Amelia Perez. Best Director was for Brady Corbet, excuse me, who directed The Brutalist, and then Best Screenplay went to Peter Strahan, who wrote Conclave, the papal political thriller succession story. So in terms of the analysis here, again, I kind of spoiled it earlier, but the films with the most wins were Amelia Perez with 4, and then The Brutalist with 3. And notably, there were some pretty big snubs. So Wicked, which again, I have talked about on this channel many times, I feel like that is, or maybe I felt this way a couple days ago until the awards, I felt like that was the front runner, that this was the big Oscar movie. It was critically acclaimed, audiences loved it, it spoke to our political moment, but here it only won 1 award. And it was basically a participation trophy. It was the Cinematic and Box Office Achievement Award. Basically, it's an award for movies that aren't good, theoretically, or not awards level good, in theory, but were popular or made a lot of money. So that's the only award Wicked won, which is really strange. Anora, which is one of my favorite films of the year, was shut out completely. It didn't win a single award. And the one that people aren't really talking about, because people are talking about how Wicked and Anora didn't really do well. But the one that I'm also surprised about, or not surprised, but disheartened, is Dune Part 2. I thought that was one of, if not the best film of the year, if not one of the best films of the decade, of all time. It has just lost any and all momentum that it had back when it released in February. Obviously, there's a reason why the fall is considered Oscar season, is because Oscar voters forget, right? And, you're more likely to get nominated for stuff if you release it later in the year, so it's fresh on people's mind, right? But I was hoping, because something like Get Out, Everything Everywhere All at Once, like if we're just talking about Best Picture winners, Everything Everywhere All at Once, Oppenheimer, were not award season releases. Oppenheimer released in like July, and Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think, opened around when Dune Part 2 opened, right? In terms of the time of year, I think it was like February or March or something. So, Dune also did not win anything, and I'm very, what's the opposite of hopeful? Pessimistic, of its chances going forward once the Oscars actually come around. It'll get nominated for a bunch of stuff and maybe win some craft awards or something, but in terms of taking any major prizes, I don't think it's going to happen. So all this to say, what does this mean for the Oscars? So if we're going off of the Golden Globes, it looks like Amelia Perez and The Brutalist are the frontrunners now. The Brutalist I'm not upset about, because it seemed, again, I still have yet to see it, but it seemed the word on the street is that it's an incredible film. Amelia Perez is not well liked, right? Audiences don't seem to really like it. Critics didn't really seem to like it. And a lot of people are theorizing that it's basically the Golden Globes picking a trans story as like an act of defiance against Trumpism, which is a shame because apparently like the LGBTQ community doesn't like this film. Like it's very reductive in the fact that the premise is about someone transitioning to basically hide, and then the implication again, once again, the stigma of like trans people, particularly trans women, being liars or being deceptive, right? So it's like it's if the reason is to embrace a marginalized group, the marginalized group does not like this movie. They don't feel like this represents their community. So if this ends up winning Best Picture at the Oscars, this is going to be up there with like Crash, of like these movies that within a year people are going to look back and go, how the hell did that win Best Picture? Like it's going to be at the bottom if you were to rank all the Best Picture winners. Looking at actor awards, it looks like, you know, like the awards weren't like nothing really rocked the boat too much. The only one that is really interesting is Demi Moore, right? Not to say that she didn't already have some awards momentum, but I don't think anyone thought that she was going to go all the way with this. So, you know, she's kind of become like a dark horse contender. And it would be very validating for genre films and horror films for her to win, you know, Best Actress, right, at the Academy. Though all of this to say, though, is that Wicked and other films like it, like maybe Anora, may still have a shot and may fare better with Oscar voters. And, you know, Time Magazine notes there's very little overlap between the voters for the Golden Globes and the voters for the Academy Awards. So the Golden Globes are an imperfect bellwether, right, that kind of give you a sense of maybe what the general vibe is. You know, you're not going to have a movie that isn't nominated for a Golden Globe win Best Picture, right? But there's still some overlap here. But the Golden Globes has gotten better since it's kind of had its reforms, but it's still essentially a body of made up of random people. Whereas the Academy is the American film industry, right? So I'm pretty hopeful that Wicked particularly will do a lot better than it did here. Anora, it won't do as well, but I think you're gonna see. I think if you're part of the Wicked or Anora Awards publicity team, I wouldn't be too concerned yet. I think once those Academy Award nominations come out, you'll be able to breathe a sigh of relief. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink here. Okay. Let's talk about story number 2. So Apple has reportedly stopped production of its Vision Pro headsets. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're discontinuing them. It's not necessarily a dead product, but it's definitely a reflection of the poor sales performance that the Vision Pro has had in the past year since it was launched. So if you don't know or don't know a lot about this, so this is the Apple Vision Pro. These are mixed reality headsets, and the idea is that it provides full integration, right, between physical and digital elements. So let me give you a contrast. So virtual reality, right, at least the way it is marketed, you know, completely obscures your vision, right? It's not like you can still see the world through it. It's purely a device that shows you like a VR video or a video game or whatever it is. Contrast that on the other end of the spectrum with augmented reality. So this is something like Pokemon Go or Snapchat filters. This is stuff being digitally superimposed onto real world visuals, right? So mixed reality is kind of in the middle, right? Where it's, you know, a little bit more, you know, involved than just digitally putting stuff on top of a visual of the real world. But the whole idea is it's a lot more integrated, right? So, you know, the tech explanation videos and product demos show, you know, people working on their computers, and, you know, they might have their computer in front of them, but then they have, and they can see their computer because it's also, like, you know, clear when it needs to be. But then there also will be floating digital screens above their physical screen, right? If you're looking through the goggles, right? This released about a year ago in February of 2024, and it cost $3,500. And let me say that again. It cost $3,500. That's the cost of, for me, like a month, almost 2 months rent, for me and my fiance, Viviana. Some have said that's like the price of maybe an old used car. This is astronomically expensive, especially considering not just expensive in a vacuum, but even within the realm of headsets like this, whether it be VR or AR or now I guess MR, right? A lot of acronyms here. Even within that world, it was expensive, because I think the Oculus Quest, which is like Facebook's, Meta's VR headset, I think it's like $500 or something. This is well above any competition, right? And based off the response, it didn't really justify that price point. It had a very mixed response. The general consensus seems to be that it was very technologically impressive, but not worth the price. It was not this life-changing device that, the people who used it went, it's changed the way I think about and engage with the world, right? The way a smartphone would. And inevitably sales slowed down, right? Because eventually everyone who wanted to buy one, and then the subset of those people those who could afford to, had bought one, right? It's not a device you're going to buy 8 of, right? Unless you have a big family, you want to buy one for the whole family, right? So because of this, there's this huge backlog of unsold devices. So ultimately, I think Apple went, we're going to stop making more until we sell these other ones. So again, it's not dead, but it's this is definitely a huge stumbling block. So why did this fail, right? I kind of have danced around it, but let me put it more explicitly here. There's just very little interest in headsets like this, of any kind, whether it be VR, AR, mixed reality. Consumers just don't seem to want it. And it feels like these kinds of products, at least the way it was crystallized in the Apple Vision Pro, it feels like a solution in search of a problem. Like, it's a really cool technology, but why would I need it? Is it really going to improve my life in any measurable way? It's cumbersome to wear, especially one of these that it's quite heavy. So you need to have good, neck support. You can't skip neck day, I guess. And again, it offers an interesting novelty, but it failed, and headsets like it have failed to provide the killer app, right? Like, what is like the thing that you go, I need to buy the Vision Pro just for that, and then I get all the other stuff as well, but I need it for this. It doesn't really have anything like that. And it doesn't really enhance. All it really does is slightly enhance things that you can already do. It doesn't really enhance them in any meaningful way. So, you can watch a movie, right? You can, have, like I described before, like extra screens, like, fake screens for productivity, right? But again, you can achieve do I really need to, oh man, I can't stand watching movies on my TV anymore. I just want to put on my Vision Pro, which simulates a screen that is the same proportion of my field of vision as a TV would be, but now I have to wear this giant thing on my face, and I can't engage with other people and watch the movie together unless we're both wearing it, but we also have these giant things on our faces, right? So it just was not really a good cost proposition for people. And again, the price is way too expensive. I've heard, this is a really random connection here, but I did a video last summer about Jenny Nicholson's video about the Star Wars hotel, right? And one of the things she talked about was, this idea of like, is something worth are certain things worth it, right? That phrase, worth it. And she argues that, sometimes things aren't worth it even if you can afford it. Like, it's not about if you can afford it. Like, is it worth the money you're actually paying? And I think even if you had the money, it just didn't seem like it was worth it. Again, it was other competitors are like in the 3-digit range of price. And it fundamentally misunderstood the way consumer electronics works because, you know, and maybe I'm being a little condescending, like I'm not an expert in, you know, consumer electronics, but look at game consoles as a point of comparison, right? The business model for video game consoles like a PlayStation or the Nintendo Switch has typically been to sell it at a loss. You know, so even though the PS5 is super expensive, technically every PlayStation 5 sold, Sony's losing money. So you go, well, why would they do that? Well, the idea is to get you to buy in to the ecosystem, and then they charge you $70 for a game, which of course the games themselves have production budgets that need to be recouped. But the physical production of the discs is very, very cheap, right? Especially if it's a digital purchase, there's really no cost for the distributor, right? Except for maybe just the coding of it, right? So you sell the console for a loss, but you sell the software at this huge markup. And everything kind of evens out in the end. Well, better than evens out. Eventually you make a profit, because if it evened out, the profit would be zero and these companies would go out of business, right? But with this, what they needed to do was sell it for way less, like even $1,000, right? I could see this doing much better if it was $999.99, right? Like I could see people like a cool grand. But it just didn't. I think they knew they didn't have the software to support it, or the experiences to support it, that they could make their money back later. So they were like, we're just gonna charge as much as we can now. Though all of these things are, again, not unique to Apple Vision, the Apple Vision Pro, right? This is something that has plagued VR as a technology for the past decade, if not longer. It's been one of those things that it's like, oh, it's about to become really big, and then it just never does. Though if anyone could pull it off, it seemed like Apple would be the one to do it, right? Because Apple is such an incredible brand. You know, they have a history of what I heard someone describe as being the second mouse. They're really good at being the second mouse. So, you know, like in a maze, like, you know, they're all looking for the cheese. What Apple does is when there's like a new technological innovation or a new kind of product taking the world by storm, or not actually, better put, not taking the world by storm, but has the potential to take the world by storm, they let other companies do the trial and error of design ideas and what consumers actually want, whatever. And then once things have kind of solidified around a certain kind of design principle, then Apple comes in and does that, but better, right? You know, Apple, the iPod is probably the most successful MP3 player or music player. It was certainly not the first. There had been MP3 players for years. Smartphones, right? So Apple was not the first smartphone. The iPhone was not the first smartphone. So Apple's success strategy, at least starting with like handheld personal electronics, starting with like the iPod. I don't know enough about the history of Apple when it comes to like their computers and whatnot, but I'm sure it's a similar situation there. You have a brand that does this, but again, because of how strong the brand is and people trust Apple, right? Implicitly. So consumers are willing to take the plunge with new technologies that they don't quite understand because it's Apple, right? You had people so not only was the iPhone better than every smartphone that had come before, but even if it was just as good, people were more willing to get an iPhone than any other prior smartphone because it was Apple, right? So it makes you wonder, if Apple can't even get this right, then the whole thing might be a I don't want to call it a waste of time, but just a garden that is not going to grow at least the way you want it to, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm really into artistic, the way artistic ambition and mediums intersect with technology. And I've been wondering, like, is there a use case for this? And I think that companies should be making headsets like these, but they need to be much more specialized. What they're doing now is trying to make the iPhone again, something that is for general use, for general consumers, and it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It has multiple different kinds of functions, and no one person's experience with the iPhone is the same. Different apps, different settings if you really want to get even granular, right? What they need to do, what companies need to do is make something the opposite of that. They need to make something that's specialized, right? So, for example, I could see something like this doing really well and you're already seeing this being used, but I don't know if there's specific devices for this exactly, but like for architecture and design. Like imagine if you're an architect and you're working with a client, and you guys are talking about something in the blueprint. Imagine if you'd be able to go, you know what? Let's take it to the virtual space. And then you both put on, that'd be the catchphrase. Let's take it to the virtual space. And you both put on your headsets, and then you could be in a 3D rendering of what this is going to be, so you can get a sense of like, oh, should this wall be here or not? Like instead of trying to imagine it, you could see it, right? And you could have special tools and hand controls for certain things related to design, right? Another idea would be like medical scenarios. So like maybe not during a surgery, but maybe some kind of a physical evaluation. The doctor could put it on and be able to superimpose graphics or effects onto people, and it can, I'm not a medical person, so I don't know what that actually would look like or what it would be like, but that's another example of something that would be a lot more specialized, so that you can justify the cost, because then you're not selling to consumers, you're selling to businesses. A business might be more willing to pay for a $3,500 headset. You could probably charge even more, and they would be willing to do it, because that would be a very actualable, if that's even a word, manifested value. And again, we were joking, but again, this idea of certain kinds of jobs that do require multiple screens, most of the time it's probably just easier just to have physical multiple screens, but certain kinds of jobs, it might be useful to have visible screens or visible boxes of display, but the ones that you can easily start like moving around really quickly. Like, I don't know, maybe stock trading or coding, I don't know, but it feels like the opportunity here is to make something for a very specific audience, but these companies have no interest in doing that because they want to try to Apple wants everybody to have an Apple Vision Pro, but I guess they hadn't taken a look at unemployment numbers lately, in that maybe most people maybe the average person can't afford, or even if they can afford, they can't justify a $3,500 purchase for something like this. Okay, before going on to story number 3, I want to give a quick plug to a podcast I do with my fiance, Viviana, called Now That's What I Call a Franchise, where each season we pick a film franchise and we go through every single installment, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This last season we did Star Wars, which was so much fun. This upcoming season, which I think is going to be premiering, I think January 24th, we're going to be starting Middle Earth. So like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that good stuff. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube if that's your preferred way to podcast. You can also just find us in the link down in the description below. Okay, let me grab a drink here quick. Okay. Let's talk about story number 3. So Paramount and Skydance have asked the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. They've gone and said, please, 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 FCC. They've asked the FCC to dismiss objections that have been made to their proposed merger. So the wrap notes that why they're going to the FCC is because, the FCC must review and approve the deal, because part of the deal, there's a required transfer of broadcast licenses, right? So, and that's something that the FCC issues. If you've been watching this channel for any period of time, you've probably heard me talking about the Paramount Skydance merger. This is an $8 billion roughly merger. The long and short of the story, I've done many videos about this on this channel. The long and short of it is, for the past year or so, Paramount was looking for a buyer. Right, currently it's owned by National Amusements, which is a company owned by Sherry Redstone, the Redstone family, her father, Charles, Sumner Redstone, I forget his name. It's been so long since I talked about Paramount. They were looking for someone to buy Paramount Global. And there were a couple different suitors at different times with different kinds of offers of what they would want to buy or whether they would buy the whole thing. But Skydance was the most interested. This is a smaller production company, founded and run by David Ellison, who's the son of tech mogul, founder of Oracle, Larry Ellison. So there's definitely a lot of money there. He was the most interested. And this kind of went back and forth for months because the deal that Skydance has really proposed would disproportionately benefit Sherry Redstone versus regular shareholders. So there was concern that it might not be approved by shareholders. Sony entered the mix at one point, wanting to buy a Paramount, or at least interested in looking at it. All the dust finally settled, and they figured out the deal in July. And there's been a couple hiccups here and there, but more or less, it's kind of been in a state of, okay, we figured this out. But nevertheless, like I said, there have been some hiccups, right? And there have been objections filed with the FCC. So one such objection comes from the Center for American Rights. And their complaint is that part of the investment, because it's not just Skydance, it's not just their money. It's kind of a consortium of investors, with Skydance being the biggest piece of that. Part of it is there's an investment from Tencent Holdings, which is like a media company from a Chinese media company. And this investment raises, quote, troubling questions about undue foreign influence from China, end quote. The Center for American Rights is also claiming, that CBS was biased. Oh, CBS, of course, is owned by Paramount Global. They are claiming and objecting that CBS is biased against Trump. I did a video about this, the whole, scandal of 60 Minutes interviewing Kamala Harris and using one part of her answer for a promo and then another part of the answer for the actual program. Trump called it false advertising and election interference and all this stuff. And one of Trump's picks for the FCC is saying, maybe we need to look into CBS and maybe do something as retribution for that. And the Wrap notes that CAR, or the Center for American Rights, they'd be willing to, remove their objection on the condition that CBS and Paramount Global avoid any foreign influence or ideological bias, right? Another objection is from a company, LiveVideoAI.corp. Their complaint is that they wanted to bid on Paramount, but that I guess they weren't able to for some bureaucratic red tape reason, and so they're calling the whole process rigged, that it wasn't a fair bidding process, which I don't know a lot about, but it feels like, anyone can sell to whoever they want. I don't know if that's really a valid criticism. And then we also have an objection from a company, Fuse Media. And their objection is that they believe the merger is, quote, likely to exacerbate Paramount's current anti-competitive treatment of independent programming services to the detriment of competition and viewpoint diversity, end quote. Of course, Paramount has refuted these objections. They've called these objections meritless, unwarranted, and this is my favorite, procedurally defective. In response to specifically the complaints from CAR and Live Video AI, saying, quote, Paramount says neither party identifies any transaction-related harm that could merit denying the applications or imposing conditions, end quote. Here's the thing. Paramount really needs this deal to go through. Like I said, they were looking all last year. Paramount is definitely, of all the major American film distributors, is definitely one of the lower ones, just in terms of their success, both cultural success as well as financial success. So something needs to change. And I've talked about this a lot on the channel, that, whatever happens, the status quo cannot hold. That they will have to sell to somebody or completely change the corporate structure of this company. So this merger has to happen. On the flip side, Skydance really, really, really wants it to happen. I mean, so much shit, over the spring and summer trying to get this deal through. The fact that Skydance stuck it out showed just how desperate David Ellison was to get this. Whether it be for his own ego or what have you, I don't know. But it's kind of like too big to fail is the wrong word, but too important to fail. Like there's a lot riding on this merger happening. And the Wrap notes that the deal is still on track to close in like the first half of 2025. So, my guess is that these objections will most likely either be dismissed or resolved in some way. Some kind of compromise will be made, some kind of action taken to signal to the objector or pacify them in some kind of way or mollify them, right? But again, I talked about this on my 2024 in review video, that this is the canary in the coal mine for the entertainment industry, or at least the film part of that sector, because, it's going to keep, the industry is going to keep shrinking. So you're going to see a lot more of these major companies having these kind of existential crises. Paramount's just having it first because it's in the weakest position. But don't be surprised, if to see more things like this happening down the road with other companies. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay, let me grab another drink. Okay. Let's talk about story number 4. So the Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni feud just keeps on going. So Justin Baldoni has filed a $250 million libel lawsuit against the New York Times for their reporting on his feud with Blake Lively. And feud, the word feud almost feels like an understatement. Like it really is full on conflict, right? This is related to the New York Times article, quote, "We can bury anyone inside a Hollywood smear campaign," end quote. So I talked about this. I did a whole video about Blake Lively's accusations against Justin Baldoni, and a big part of that was this New York Times article. But I'm going to put a pin in that. We'll talk about the context in just a second. Just hold on. Hold your horses. As part of this libel lawsuit, the plaintiffs also include publicists Melissa Nathan and Jennifer Abel, who are the primary, this New York Times article published a lot of texts, and it was primarily between Melissa Nathan and Jennifer Abel, these publicists. And this lawsuit claims that the New York Times article, quote, "cherry-picked and altered communication stripped of necessary context and deliberately spliced to mislead," end quote. So again, I promised you I would get to it. Let me take the pin out. Let's talk about the context. So Blake Lively, over the summer, starred in a movie called It Ends With Us, with an adaptation of a very popular romantic drama novel about domestic violence and emotional abuse. And she starred in the movie with her co-star and director, Justin Baldoni. And rumors were flying for weeks during this production, and then following the production, just all the tensions on set between Lively and Baldoni. To the point where the press tour for the movie was conducted separately, which is strange, right? And they kind of have two different approaches to the press tour, right? So Lively focused on positivity, really making it about women's empowerment, kind of like a girl, like, oh, go with your girlies, go wear your best floral outfits, right? By contrast, Baldoni focused on like survivors of domestic violence and like the way the film, shines a light on these issues, right? And very recently, and like I said, I did a video about this on the channel, kind of a deep dive if you want to go check that out. Lively supposedly filed a letter with the California Civil Rights Department against Baldoni and the production company Wayfarer Studios. Variety does note that these letters are meant to be confidential unless leaked, and they note that they couldn't verify that she even filed the letter, right? And the lawsuit from Baldoni says, quote, "Notably, Lively chose not to file a lawsuit against Baldoni, Wayfarer, or any of the plaintiffs, a choice that spared her from the scrutiny of the discovery process, including answering questions under oath and producing her communications. This decision was no accident," end quote. So what they're saying is that this was basically a legal filing made, if it was even made, to so there was something for a publication like the New York Times to write about, so that the story could get out there, right? That's the claim. They argue that Lively coordinated a sophisticated, or rather, excuse me, Lively's complaint claims that there was a coordinated and sophisticated smear campaign against her to discredit her, right, in the court of public opinion. And again, like I said, part of that New York Times article published these damning texts between Nathan and Abel, more or less confirming those accusations that there was this concentrated smear campaign. So what are the allegations of this lawsuit, right? So what is Baldoni and his group saying in response? So they argue that Lively herself conducted a, quote, quote-unquote strategic and manipulative smear campaign of her own. They argue that she used false, quote, sexual harassment allegations to assert unilateral control over every aspect of the production, end quote. So they're arguing that she brought up these potentially bogus sexual harassment accusations to try to assert more producerial control on the project. The lawsuit also claims that Lively's husband, of course, famous Ryan Reynolds, verbally berated Baldoni during like a meeting where they, I think like they all met to try to like reconcile these issues. One producer, I think from Sony, who distributed the movie, I think one producer present said, quote, in his 40-year career, and this is a quote from the lawsuit, not from the producer, this producer said, quote, in his 40-year career, he had never seen anyone speak to someone like that in a meeting, end quote. And supposedly Ryan Reynolds even allegedly tried to pressure Baldoni's agency, WME, to drop Baldoni, which eventually did happen once the New York Times story kind of broke. And then the lawsuit is also, speaking of the New York Times, the lawsuit claims that the New York Times selectively chose evidence, like that quote I said earlier, that, you know, they kind of cherry-picked and removed things from the context to imply certain conclusions, right? Baldoni's attorney, Brian Friedman, a very controversial entertainment kind of lawyer in this sphere. I feel like I've talked about him a lot, but I can never remember what cases I talked about him for. He says that the New York Times, quote, cowered to the wants and whims of two powerful, untouchable, quote unquote, Hollywood elites, meaning Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, disregarding journalistic practices and ethics once befitting of the revered publication by using doctored and manipulated text and intentionally omitting texts which dispute their chosen PR narrative. So Brian Friedman and Baldoni's argument is that, you know, this isn't just it's not the New York Times was misinformed, that the New York Times themselves intentionally, you know, helped craft this narrative. For example, there was one text exchange about there was like a negative article about Lively. The New York Times article highlights this text exchange, which I'm confused about how they got these texts, because neither the original story I did about this, nor this research for this story tonight explains how they got these text messages. Maybe I missed the details, so feel free, if you know, to comment or let me know, because I'm like, how did they get these messages? But for example, there was a negative story about Lively over the summer and the fall, and there was a text exchange between Nathan and Abel, basically complimenting themselves on like, oh, like you did such a great job with this, right? Implying like, oh, they helped plant this story. But newly released, the full version of the exchange reveals that, you know, they start the conversation by saying like, oh, it's a shame because we had nothing to do with this. And the part that the New York Times used was almost them being kind of like sarcastic, like, oh, you did such a good job, like, right? So it's not necessarily that there wasn't the smear campaign, but that's just one example of the full picture gives you a different understanding of the events. And the lawsuit went on to say, quote, the Times story relied almost entirely on Lively's unverified and abundance of evidence. Relied entirely on Lively's unverified and self-serving narrative, lifting it nearly verbatim while disregarding an abundance of evidence that contradicted her claims and exposed her true motives, end quote. So this is a pretty strong argument. Not so much strong in terms of it's valid, but strong in terms of they're really bringing out the receipts. Like, this is not just kind of a perfunctory, you know, my client, you know, denies these accusations and they will, this is very detailed of like, no, this happened and then this happened, and here's the evidence. And this isn't to say that the Lively story was very flat either, because they'd also outlined very specific situations, right? So of course the response to this, you know, the people involved are pushing back. So the New York Times published and notably, I don't know if all of them, but one of the authors of that New York Times article was one of the authors of that kind of helped break the Harvey Weinstein situation back in 2017. You know, so pretty prominent journalists within this world. The New York Times, as an organization, put out a statement saying, quote, "The role of an independent news organization is to follow the facts where they lead. Our story was meticulously and responsibly reported. It was based on a review of thousands of pages of original documents, including the text messages and emails that we quote accurately and at length in the article. To date, Wayfarer Studios, Mr. Baldoni, the other subjects of the article, and their representatives have not pointed to a single error," which I don't know if is true. "We published their full statement in response to the allegations in the article as well. We plan to vigorously defend against the lawsuit," end quote. And libel is really hard to prove in the American legal system for a good reason, right? So it's a very high bar. In order to legally prove defamation or libel, right, in this case, you have to prove that there was intentional disregard for the facts, that they knew what they were publishing was wrong, but did it anyway. If it's just wrong, we have free speech rights, right? But there has to be an intentional disregard for the fact and actual material harm to the person, right? And that so Baldoni's team has their work cut out for them, because it's always harder, right, if you're the plaintiff in a case like this. Lively, in response to this, because again, before it was kind of this potentially not even real legal complaint with California Civil Rights Group. She has now officially filed a lawsuit against Baldoni and Wayfarer Studios. And I have a quote here from her legal team saying, quote, "Unfortunately, Miss Lively's decision to speak out has resulted in further retaliation and attacks. As alleged in Miss Lively's federal complaint, Wayfarer and its associates have violated federal and California state law by retaliating against her for reporting sexual harassment and workplace safety conditions. Now the defendants will answer for their conduct in federal court," end quote. And ultimately, this is like a good thing when it comes to the truth, because now that there's actual lawsuits, there will be discovery and testimony under oath and all this stuff. So we're gonna get to the bottom of this, right? But the point of all this is, there's so much we don't know about things going on that we were not present for, right? So I originally did a story about Blake Lively, kind of being criticized for being kind of insensitive on the press tour for It Ends With Us, and talking about how, by contrast, Baldoni was using this platform to talk about domestic abuse. But then when this information came out, I immediately, did a story about it and talked about, I fell for the smear campaign. I fell because part of the campaign was to make her look insensitive, and supposedly Baldoni would talk about domestic abuse to explicitly draw that contrast, right? And I talked about how there's so much we don't know. I'm not going back again and going, oh, actually, you know what, Baldoni was right and Lively was lying the whole time. I think what this illustrates is that the truth is almost always somewhere in the middle, especially when you have two famous people, or like people in this world. It's ego tends to dominate and fuel these kinds of situations and blind both sides to all of the facts. It's not that I believe the majority of what Lively is claiming is true, but I'm also almost inclined to, not the same extent, because just power structures favor men. Let's just get that out there. But I'm inclined to believe a lot of what Baldoni has said is also true in terms of the facts. So people go, well, how can that both be? It's like, well, because a lot of what they say are not mutually exclusive, right? Both of their arguments can be somewhat true. What the answer is that you just have two people doing things that are not cool in response to the other person doing things not cool. So then I guess it becomes a question of, well, like, what was the inciting incident? Who started the back and forth? But at the end of the day, until a trial, again, where a lot more of this is going to come to light, news sources and the media, including me, we can only ever get a glimpse into the truth. And so we can only give you what we can glean. And what we can glean is, we weren't there. We were not a fly on the wall. So this is a developing story, right? We are going to hear a lot more about this, and you're going to hear about it a lot more on this channel. I am predicting for 2025. But if you thought that the slew of support for Lively following her, the initial kind of unearthing of this information and the subsequent kind of ostracizing of Baldoni, if you thought that was the end of this story, you have another thing coming. Whether it should be the end of the story is a whole other case. Again, I'm more inclined to take Lively's side more than Baldoni's, but it seems like a case of two not so great people doing some not so great stuff to each other. In the end, one may have been more not so great, but we're not talking about an angel versus a devil here on either side. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay, let's talk about story number 5. So, the Pulitzer Prize winning editorial cartoonist. What a great descriptor. I wish I could have something like that, but I'm awful at drawing. The Pulitzer Prize winning editorial cartoonist Ann Telnace, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. She has resigned from the Washington Post. And this all has to do with this situation where she's claiming that the newspaper allegedly refused to publish a political cartoon she made criticizing the owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos. She said, quote, "I have had editorial feedback and productive conversations and some differences about cartoons I have submitted for publication. But in all that time, I've never had a cartoon killed because of who or what I chose to aim my pen at until now," end quote. So the cartoon in question you see over here to my left, I gotta do a little pause. I love political cartoons. I always loved, like, in middle school or high school history class when we would look at like political cartoons from the era. The iconic one is of all the money bags in Congress during the Gilded Age, right? Because these little kind of sardonic, satirical little cartoons do a lot at illustrating a fundamental truth about politics or people or society or whatever it might be, right? So as you see here to my left, it depicts Bezos along with other wealthy tech individuals. You can tell Bezos is the one in the back, right? The bald one. And I resent the bald hating. Anyway, it depicts Bezos along with these other individuals kneeling before what looks like an altar of Trump, offering money. You even see Mickey Mouse, literally, like completely worshiping the statue. Of course, that's a reference to Disney settling the defamation case with Trump, even though they could have easily won it, but they just didn't want to rock the boat in any way with Trump. Telnace said about this, quote, "The cartoon criticizes the billionaire tech and media chief executives who have been doing their best to curry favor with Trump. While it isn't uncommon for editorial page editors to object to visual metaphors within a cartoon if it strikes that editor as unclear or isn't correctly conveying the message intended by the cartoonist, such editorial criticism was not the case regarding this cartoon. To be clear, there have been instances where sketches have been rejected or revisions requested, but never because of the point of view inherent in the cartoon's commentary. That's a game changer and dangerous for a free press," end quote. So her argument is, I've never had a cartoon rejected for the ideological reasons behind it. But of course, we can't have one criticizing the boss, right? He doesn't operate the Washington Post, but he is, at the end of the day, the owner. Of course, the Post denies these accusations, putting out a statement saying, quote, "Not every editorial judgment is a reflection of a malign force. My decision," I think this is like the lead editor. "My decision was guided by the fact that we had just published a column on the same topic as the cartoon and had already scheduled another column, this one a satire, for publication," end quote. Which is such a bogus answer, because, publications like this, all they do is post repetitive opinion pieces all of the time. So that's never stopped the Washington Post or any of these other media companies. That's never stopped them before. So it feels like a really unfortunate coincidence if you are in the position to have to defend this, right? That's a very strange coincidence to be happening. And not only is this, an issue with free speech, but the criticism is warranted, right? The Washington Post has gotten into some, and Jeff Bezos has gotten into some hot water as of late because, notably Jeff Bezos, there was going to be a endorsement of Kamala Harris from the Washington Post, but Jeff Bezos killed it. Obviously because this is before the election. He didn't want to, if Trump won, which of course it's not if he did, but right before the election, he's like, well, if Trump wins, I don't want to be the owner of a major paper that endorsed his opponent, because Trump is vindictive, right? And I don't want to get on his bad side because I have a lot of, I'm doing Blue Origin and doing all this spaceship stuff, and I don't want to lose potentially any government contracts, right? And it's not just doing things to avoid pissing Trump off, but it's also trying to appease him, right? Like curry favor, as the quote said, and he's just one of several of these, millionaires and billionaires who have donated to Trump's inauguration, right? As like a sign of Democratic support for the incoming president, right? And like I said, people like Bezos are trying to get in good with Trump, or at the very least, not do things to piss him off. So I think, at the end of the day, it's a private company. It can do whatever it wants. So this isn't this Cartoonist, her free speech hasn't been violated. It's not the fact that we could see this cartoon here at all, and she's not going to jail for it, means we still have free speech in this country for now, right? January 20th onward, it might be a little touch and go. But all joking aside, the thing with Trump is not that he and his Republicans in Congress are going to repeal the First Amendment, right? Or go after people, right? He doesn't have to use the government to censor the media, because they'll do it themselves. They will self-censor. And again, I've talked about this before, but this reminds me of in Hollywood in the 30s, Hollywood basically got together, and this was illegal technically, but they got together and said, look, we don't want the government regulating us, so we're going to regulate ourselves in terms of what kind of content we put in our movies. And that's how you get the production code. So that's how you go from a period of really risque, suggestive, transgressive films through the teens and the 20s and up to the mid-30s. And then, like, overnight, everything, that's how you get, like, the Dick Van Dyke, sleeping in separate beds kind of trouble. That was TV, but same kind of idea. And this is similar, where, the government won't have to step in because the media companies will settle, right? Or not take these plunges at all, right? They would rather not deal with a lengthy legal battle, even if they would win that battle in the end. They figure it's not worth going through it. We would rather just not rock the boat. So this is not the end of the world, but, it's just another little piece of a story that is going to be reflected on in the history books of like, we're kind of in like a second Gilded Age, and you have these robber baron types who are, trying as best they can to use the immense wealth that they've amassed, using that for their own ambitions and trying to influence the political world. So this in and of itself is not a huge major story, but it's going to be a piece of that story. But the rest, as Natasha Bedingfield would say, the rest is still unwritten, the way she says it. Okay, so that wraps up the show. Just want to give one final plug. Cinema and Cuso is not just a YouTube channel. It started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I publish written reviews for new movies coming out. I've been doing it for almost 3 years now. I have like over 100 reviews up there. It would really mean a lot to me for you to go check that out. Go comment and let me know why you disagree with all my opinions. You wouldn't be the first one, so you can get in line. You can find that in the link in the description below. You can also just go to your browser, type in cinemaandcuso.substack.com. Once again, thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like this video. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm so more people can find the channel. So if you have found the channel, why not subscribe? It would really mean a lot to me, trying to grow this community. And I do this, like I said, every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time.